Good morning. Thank you. Well, we know this topic is very popular, and the people are very popular, and we welcome you all on behalf of the Institute and Bob Steele and Walter Isaacson and all my colleagues. It's a great pleasure to see you're all still hanging in there and going to lots of sessions. This is an especially, obviously, important and interesting session, and we have wonderful guests, and we're so happy to have the three of you. I'm going to pass it on to David Leonhardt and let him talk about what's to come and introduce our guests. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, David and Bob, for being here. Thank you all for coming. My wife has been laughing for the last few days about how this panel is up directly against should pot be legalized. So I'd like to thank you all for choosing this one over that. And
I thought that was the subject of this panel. That's what I prepared for.
If during Q&A you'd like to ask them about pot. So obviously, you don't need a long introduction from me about Bob and David. They both have worked at the top levels of our financial markets. They've worked at the top levels of our government. And while it's not the focus of our conversation, they've worked at the top levels on an advisory board basis of higher education. So we may even wander there. Today is David's first day as the chairman of the Board of Trustees at Duke, and Bob has been on the board at Harvard. So let's start with the direct subject of our conversation, which is what the markets tell us about the economy. And I'm going to start with a question with something of a pessimistic cast and ask you each to engage with it, which is for all essentially of recorded economic history, we've had these pessimistic arguments that the good times are over, that there's something fundamentally different about the era we live in, that prosperity is coming to an end. It's Malthus's argument, it's the Luddites' argument, and they've just been wrong again. We've continued to become...
Depends what era you're looking at.
Depends what era you're looking at, right? And so that actually will feed nicely into my question. We've become more prosperous, we live longer, we enjoy higher material standards of living than any of our predecessors. And so on the one hand, you could dismiss some of the pessimism today as just the latest version of that and say it's been wrong. But I think it's more serious than that, and I think it's worth engaging with it. I think if you look at our markets today, you look at the S&P, it's pretty expensive relative to long-term earnings, the kind of measures that Bob Shiller likes. If you look at our economy, it's been growing at a disappointing or mediocre rate for more than a dozen years now. Most Americans have not had an increase in median income or only a slight one. And so I guess what I would ask you is, on a basic level, are the rise that we've seen in the market since '09, is it telling us something false? And are we headed into a future of a sort of new normal, a dark new normal, in which economic growth will be disappointing, markets will advance and then come back? And are the pessimists right this time, finally?
What's your second question?
That is it.
First, I want to thank everybody for coming. This is the biggest crowd to which I've spoken since my bar mitzvah, and I think some of you were at my bar mitzvah. But clearly, there is a religious overtone to some extent. To the extent some people always think that the world is always going to get worse, and certain religions always make you think the world is falling apart, and you can't think the world is always going to get better because then you wouldn't have anything to atone for. So. And there's always a perception that this time is different, and that we have either solved problems and that we aren't going to see them again, or that we have certain new issues to deal with, but basically we are past some of the traditional problems. You may remember that at the time right before the bubble burst in 2007 or 8, there was a view in some circles that we were now so smart that we had in effect repealed the business cycle, and that the new data we had, the Fed was so much smarter, that all the computers we had enabled us to avoid the ups and downs that we'd experienced for 100 years or so or more of economic history in the country. That turned out not to be the case. In my own view now is that what really has happened over the last 5 or 6, 7 years since the recession theoretically ended. The recession theoretically ended on June 2009. because we define recessions as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. And so we ended that in June of 2009. But my view is a recession is very outdated, and we should redefine recession, because my view is that when the unemployment rate goes back to where it was before the recession, maybe you've ended a recession. I don't really think we technically, in my view, ended the recession and really are still coming out of what was a very long-term recession. And because the Great Recession was so deep, we underestimated how long it would take to get out of it. And I think we're still in the throes of getting out of it. And we've got another year or two before we're really going to be back to the kind of economic growth, unemployment rate that you really would expect after a recession ends. So I'd say right now we are struggling to figure out what the good signs there are in the economy and try to take advantage of those signs and say, yes, housing is really good now, the energy revolution is good now, manufacturing is increasing. But still, we can't overlook the fact that we have unemployment much higher than it really should be. It was at low point in George W. Bush, 4.5%. Maybe full employment now is 5 or 5.5%, but it's not 7.6. And the real marginally attached rate is about 13.4. And so that's probably the real unemployment rate. And we also experienced economic growth, best case this year of 2.5%, best case. And we really should be growing at 3% or maybe slightly better if we're going to really have the kind of economic prosperity we want. And unfortunately, as you point out, the income disparity is growing in our country. The wealthy are getting wealthier and the poor are getting relatively poor. So I think we've got a long way to go before we get to any point where we can say we are comfortable where the economy is going. And I don't really know I have the solution for it. I was in government, as you pointed out, and I was asked, and I left 33 years ago, and I haven't been invited back since. So there's no evidence that I really have a solution for it. The most famous and best Treasury Secretary in the modern era is right here, and I think he has an answer for the solution to our economic problems, right?
David, I actually do. And I would, if somebody asked me that question, say, let's turn to the most successful investor in modern American history, David. I can toss the ball back, too. Let me one quick comment on what David said, and I'd like to take this from a different direction, if I could, David.
Please.
I agree with David. I think we are still mired. It's a slow recovery, as David said, and as David also said, there's something called U6. I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but it's a much better measure in some ways of underemployment in this country. And it's the unemployed, it's the discouraged workers, and it's the part-time workers. I didn't look at it recently, but last time I looked at it, it was about 14%. It can't be, I think, did you say 13%?
Marginally rich, about 13.4, around there.
So we're still in a time of very serious duress. And I do think that, I at least think, that while in some measure that was a function of just the difficulty of recovering from a very deep recession, I also think we've had very serious policy failures. And I think that's a function of fundamentally having a Congress that's deadlocked. And I think had we had a better set of policies, and I do have some views to what those might have been, I think even though this still would have been a very difficult time, I think we could have done better. But let me get at this slightly differently, David. I think markets are psychological phenomena. And I think at any given time, they're highly likely to be in excess in one direction or the other direction. And I think it's impossible to judge which, well, at least I think as one person, that's impossible to judge where you are in that range of excess. So what I do personally, at least, and it's what I did when I was in a policy-making position, and also before that when I ran as co-head of Goldman Sachs, I look at underlying fundamentals, and I try to look at long-term fundamentals, make some judgments about those, and as those are extremely difficult to judge, as you just think of the issues that David raised with respect to the shorter term, and then think of trying to make long-term judgments. But having said that, I do have a view. I would rather invest in the United States for the long term than any other major economy in the world. I think we have enormous strengths with the dynamism and entrepreneurialism of our society, with our flexible labor and capital market, even with our demographics relative to China and the Eurozone, with the natural resources, as David mentioned, particularly in the shale, gas, and oil. Now, I think with the new technologies and manufacturing, although the jobs may not come back because they may be very, very low labor intensity manufacturing, we can see a lot of manufacturing come back. I would rather invest here in other, as I say, other major economy in the world. Now, there's one very big caveat to that. I believe that gives us the potential to do very well, but to do that, it seems to me that we have to have a sound fiscal position, we have to have robust public investment, the areas are critical to our economy, and we need reform in a whole array of areas that are critical, healthcare, K through 12 education, energy, and so forth. All of those, all three of those, are doable. Marty Feldstein, who's, as you all know, a highly esteemed economist, said to me not long ago, he's a Republican, he said, if you and I being a Democrat, if you and I sat down, we could solve most of these issues and could develop frameworks that would work. But the problem is we have a political system that is highly dysfunctional. And so I think what it comes back to is that the essential economic problem of our country in the long term is not an economic problem. I think we have tremendous dynamics, tremendous strength that should cause us to be very successful. But our fundamental problem is, will we have a government that works at least moderately well, not very well, moderately well, so that it meets our challenges? And if we do, I just said, winding up where I started, I think we can be enormously successful over time. Now, I'll just finish with one more comment, and that is, now you just say, what about the stock market? I have no idea whether the stock market properly reflects that potential, whether it is substantial excess relative to that potential, or it understates that potential. One thing I do know is that whatever that stock market may be relative to the potential, you also have to look at the short term. Because even if it is attractive, and I'm not saying it is, I don't have a view, but even if it is, you can have enormous ups and downs in the short term, and both psychologically and financially, you have to live through the short term to get to the long term. As we all know, John Maynard Keynes said you can be right in the long term and go broke in the short term.
It's also said in the long term we're all dead, but...
You also in the long term we're all dead. I think both comments, well, the first comment was certainly right, and the one that you raised,
right,
based on all current evidence, is also right.
Okay.
In a real world way, what is it that would improve the political system? And then what is it, assuming the best thing can actually get done, what could help it that may have a legitimate chance of getting done in the next 5 to 10
Help
years?
the political system?
The
or
political
economy?
system become more functional.
Well, every generation thinks that its government is not working very well. If you go back to the time when Washington was president, he almost wanted to resign because he thought the government was so dysfunctional then. And Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they had the same problems. They were worried about insurrection against the government being taken over by other forces. We have a dysfunctional government in the sense that the government is not moving forward with one voice and doing something that we would like it to do, solve some of our problems, economic problems, income disparity problems, and debt problems. However, I think the markets have concluded that Washington is a bit of a kabuki dance. They will dance around a bit, and they'll have all kinds of press conferences and blaming other people, but nothing that Washington's going to do in the next year or so is going to damage the economy all that much, because the economy and market forces have really kind of isolated what Congress and the President are doing. The only game in Washington the last year or so has been Ben Bernanke and what the Fed has done, and assuming the Fed does what it's going to do, which is taper off, but in a gradual way, I don't think that the economy is going to be harmed by anything done in Washington. How can we make Washington operate better? Well, I think if you were to eliminate money from politics, that would help a lot. Members of Congress spend 2/3 of their time raising money. And interestingly, why do members of Congress need money? Think about it. 95% of the people that run for re-election don't lose. So why are they so worried? And every member of Congress who retires or loses, when I see them, and they usually come to me for a job or something afterwards, they all say the same thing. I've never been so happy as when I'm out of Congress. So why are they so determined to stay in Congress? Because it's a terrible job. They got to do all the, they don't make any money, all this. But anyway, they're obsessed with staying in Congress, and they need money to do that, and they need it for 3 reasons. One, they have to pay for these campaigns because the media buys are 90% of the campaign costs, and it's very expensive. Second, they're not really likely to lose, but they want to pile up a big pile of money because it deters people from running against them. It's like a weapons game. The more nuclear weapons you have, less likely you're going to be attacked. The more money you have in your bank, less likely somebody will run against you. And the third reason is that now it's being used by members of Congress to buy, in effect, committee chairmanships. That's a little bit overstated, but if you give money from one member of Congress to another member, which is now a practice that's going on for 20-some years, you can, buy some favors. So members of Congress aren't as dependent on the seniority system, so they can, in effect, make friends with other members by giving them some of the money they have that they don't really need. I think that would be one of the most important things we could do. I also feel that today the internet and the obsession with cable TV and what some people are going to say about them is so strong that members of Congress are afraid of doing anything that shows any profiles and courage. And last, I'd say the gerrymandering that has occurred now has now made it's so unlikely that certain members of the House or Representatives can possibly lose that they're invulnerable to discussions about doing something good for the country. And so I think it's a very unfortunate situation that President Obama has inherited, and one that he's not likely to solve, which is to say the country and the government is so dependent on campaign funds and is so unfocused on the national good as opposed to their own congressional needs that I think it's not likely to be changed anytime soon.
Well, before Bob jumps in, one thing that I actually worry about is harder to solve is the gerrymandering issue. Ruth Marcus mentioned this morning. In some ways, we have self-gerrymandered as a country. If you go back and you look at presidential elections, what was the final margin in this election? 6 points? 5 points? Is that what Obama won by? If you go back and look at similar presidential elections from 30, 40 years ago, there were fewer swing states this time for the same closeness of a presidential election. And you can go through elections and do this. Controlling for the closeness of the election, we now have fewer swing states, which is a way of saying we have self-selected ourselves into communities and counties and congressional districts and states that are less politically diverse. And so in some ways, the polarization is something that even redistricting...
That's a very good point. Before Bob makes a point on this, when John Kennedy ran for election against Richard Nixon in 1960, Richard Nixon made a mistake, perhaps. He said, I'll campaign all 50 states, because he thought that maybe he had a chance in most of those states. John Kennedy actually campaigned in 49 states. He didn't make a pledge, but he actually campaigned in 49 states, because most of those states were up for grabs. Now, presidential campaigns, you're really campaigning in 4 to 5 states of great consequence, maybe 8 to 10, but probably in the end you get down to 4 to 5 states, because most states are so predictable, because as you say, people now live with people who think similarly to them. So for example, nobody running for president of the United States who's a Republican thinks they can win California. And nobody who's a Democrat today thinks that they can win, let's say, Georgia or Alabama. And so you have a very narrow self-selection, and it does skewer the way our political system comes up with decisions on the economy and other things. Bob?
Yeah, I guess, David, I agree with most of what David said, except I think it's a really very fundamental problem, and I don't think our country will succeed unless this improves. Pew has done a study, and according to Pew's study, Congress today is more partisan in the way that it votes than any time since Reconstruction. So while it's true that all of us may look back and see that the past, think that the past was a bit more of a golden era than in fact it was, if you look at Pew's study, it not suggests, but it's, at least the study shows, is that this is a more partisan time in our Congress than any time since Reconstruction. Vice President Mondale, who David knows well, was in New York a few months ago, and he and my wife and I had dinner. What he said was, you know, when I was there was tremendous political fighting, and it was partisan. It was all much like you see today, but with one very big difference. Most of the members of Congress, not all, but most, were committed to govern, and they were willing to work together to find common ground on most issues. Today, there is virtually no willingness to compromise, and democracy can't work without a willingness to compromise. So I think it's a very, very difficult issue. What would I do about it, David, which I think was part of your question? I don't think anybody knows, but I think our best hope is that a lot of people try a lot of different things. And I'll raise one, which one of you raised, I've forgotten which one. Oh, David raised it. The social media, I think, has become an echo chamber for ideology and for partisanship. Tim Geithner told me that being Secretary of the Treasury today, or when he was Secretary, was multiples more difficult than I was, not because, leaving aside the financial crisis, because the social media and the cable TV were having such an immense impact on members of Congress who, as soon as something was announced, they would be inundated with all sorts of blogs and emails, and then, of course, cable TV. And as you say, they run in districts very often that is kind of like themselves. The question is, could the social media be turned into a force for good? And I kind of think that there probably is an opportunity to do that. But I think it's going to take a tremendous effort on behalf of, well, I don't know who's going to do it. I have a whole theory of this with Strobe Talbot, who runs Brookings, as you know. Strobe and I have actually written a memo on this as to how it might be possible, if you had adequate funding, to create a social media modality that would engage the American people. And it's not a question of communicating to people information that will enable them to make a balanced judgment and hold their elected officials accountable. It's a matter of engaging them. It doesn't do any good to communicate if people don't engage. And it's got to be the average American in the average city. And that's going to be even trying that would be an enormous undertaking, both in terms of developing content and then finally, and vastly more expensively, the modality. But that's one thing you could try to do, David. California, another thing you could try to do. California now has a commission that's going to determine districts as opposed to it being done legislatively. That happened, I believe, through the referendum system. There are a lot of other efforts that are being made by different people who are focused on this issue, and I think our best chance is that there are these great multiplicity of efforts and that the aggregate of them changes the way our system functions. But if it doesn't, then I think we will not, I think the probabilities are we will not realize the potential that we have, and I think it's a great potential that we do have.
Maybe we should just let women run the government, because the men have run it for 200 years, and look what we've done. And maybe if we had women leading the government, it probably wouldn't be worse than what we have now. And try it, and let's see what happens.
We may be about to try that.
I wouldn't get carried away.
The social media...
By the way, could I just make one more comment?
Please.
I actually do think Washington could have done us a lot of good in this little period. I think if we had put in place, I don't know if you want to get into this or not. If we had put in place, and I won't get into all the specifics, but if we hadn't put in place a fiscal program that both dealt with the intermediate term fiscal outlook that we must deal with, and at the same time deferred implementation for 2 or 3 years, something like that, but with enforceable mechanisms, got rid of the sequester, I think you would have had a much better environment fiscally, macroeconomically, and also I think you could have really created more confidence in the business community, which means hiring and investment. I think QE3, which David mentioned, I don't know if we'll get into that or not, but I think that there's just a lot of issues about how this thing's going to get unwound and what the risks in that unwinding might be.
I think the business community, I would add, the business community, I think, was late to the game in trying to persuade members of Congress, particularly Republicans, that they should try to reach a compromise. I think the business community stayed away from it. They didn't want to get involved in lobbying. Now that's changing a bit, but I think the business community should have done a more effective job lobbying Republican members of the House to come up with a common solution on the debt limit and spending and so forth. It may be a little late now to do this. I once thought, I don't think it's realistic now, that the solution to this economic problem would be to have, in effect, a Simpson-Bowles proposal, but that it would, members of Congress would not only have to vote on it, which they didn't do, but it would go into effect automatically. In other words, once Simpson-Bowles comes up with a proposal or the equivalent of that, a government commission, it would go into effect automatically unless the Congress voted to overturn it. Because right now, I don't really think we're going to be able to get a compromise. It's probably too late to get an economic compromise. And it's a sad situation that we're now still in the beginning of the Obama administration, but unless the situation changes and the next Congress comes in differently, we're not likely to have any economic reforms, tax or spending or any kind of real economic changes out of Congress for the next 3.5 years. Because right now they're stalled, and the Republicans have the view, rightly or wrongly, that they're not going to do anything on the debt limit. They're going to let it go forward because they believe they'll be criticized and penalized if they have us default on debt, and I think they're right on that. They're not going to do anything to shut the government down because I think they have the view, and I think they're right on that. They'd be blamed if the government shut down. So they're going to basically keep sequester because sequester is the only thing that they think they can get through and without having to change the laws now. And so we're really not going to see any major economic policies coming out of Washington that are different than what we have now, unless the Fed does something dramatically different than what it's doing. Other than that, I think you're not going to get anything different than what you see now.
I think one of the things that's undercut the effectiveness of the business community is the business community tends to talk in generalities about the deficit. We need to solve our deficit, and then you go to these lobbying groups, which I've done. It's actually kind of fun, and you say, so what policies, Business Roundtable, are you in favor of that would actually cut the deficit? It is a very short list. And in fact, what business tends to be in favor of is more infrastructure spending, a lower tax rate for businesses, all of which may or may not be good things, but business has essentially been lobbying for a larger deficit, which makes it hard to...
Yeah, I think it's another big problem, David. I agree with you, by the way, that would be a mechanism that would work, but they were lobbying for Simpson-Bowles per se. The Congressional Research Service came out with a report and said that in their judgment, and that's a bipartisan, or it's nonpartisan, I guess, a nonpartisan organization, they said that in their judgment, the probability was very high that you could not achieve more than $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion of savings on the, they call them tax expenditures, but deduction preference side of the budget. That would not begin, that was probably about 1/4 or 1/3 of what you needed to make Simpson-Bowles work. You will remember that Simpson-Bowles had the idea of both bringing rates down and contributing revenues to deficit reduction. It was not either politically doable, or at least in my judgment, politically doable, I think it surely was not, and politically wise, I think it was not as well. So you had the business community raising all that money, remember that? They rallied around a plan that could not. politically have been accomplished. And I think that didn't help.
Remember, when Simpson-Bowles, everybody should remember, what Simpson-Bowles was all about was not eliminating the debt we have. We have $16.8 trillion of debt, and let's say $60 trillion of unfunded Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security liabilities, and maybe $7 trillion of Fannie Mae liabilities. But they were not going to do anything to touch that 16.8. All they were doing is saying that over the next 10 years, we're likely to have incremental debt of, let's say, $10 trillion. We would like to basically reduce that by $4 trillion. If you follow me, in other words, they were going to have $10 trillion of incremental debt added over the next 10 years. Instead of having $10 trillion, we'll cut that for only add $6 trillion, because if you add that $6 trillion to the $16.8 trillion, you'll keep your debt as a percentage of GDP at roughly the same as it is now. And that's pretty much what they were trying to do. So they weren't really going to eliminate the debt. One of the things that's changed in Washington the last couple, I'd say, month or so is this. Our debt has been running at roughly 10% of GDP, very large, largest since World War II. It was running at about $1.2 trillion a year. $1.2 trillion a year. It's now going down for this fiscal year. It might be as low as $600 billion.
The deficit, right?
The deficit, I'm saying. And next year it's projected to be maybe $315 billion. So because Washington sees it going down this way, and it's going down because economic growth is slightly better than before, tax rates, as many people in this room know, have gone up, and because of sequester spending has come down. So we're now seeing the deficit coming down from $1.2 trillion to maybe next year $315 billion, if you believe various projections. Because of that, members of Congress say, hey, what's the problem? $315 billion, that's nothing compared to what we had. So why cut any spending now, and why increase taxes? So the ardor to do anything has really gone. It's completely gone.
Yeah, that's a tragedy, I think, David, because everything you said is 100% right, and there was an opportunity to do something that could have been so meaningful. First place, you have right now, it's exactly what David said. You have a sequester, which is a terrible, terrible piece of legislation. It's an arbitrary across-the-board cut in all of our programs instead of making thoughtful policy decisions. And it is, as David said, contributing to bring down a deficit, but it is so onerous that most analysts think that it will, in one way or another, dissipate simply because of the magnitude of its effect on the programs that are critically important to the country, so that it will not, in fact, solve the problem that it was designed to solve. And it certainly doesn't create business confidence because people see that it could well erode, and secondly, it is terrible government, not good government. We could have instead had a wonderful program, and it's just a shame that Congress can't function. And I'm not making a political brief for President Obama. I happen to think very well of him, but I'm not making a brief in saying this. He proposed a program in which you would have an increase in revenues. That would be structural, so it would go into the decades beyond this when our problems become far more serious. He would have had the beginnings of entitlement reform, again, that would provide deficit reduction now, but also be structural, so go in the decades beyond that. And you put all that together with some other measures he proposed, then he would have eliminated the sequester now and given us a couple of years during which we wouldn't have the fiscal drag that we're having right now. And I think it could have made a real difference in the short term, and I think it would have put us in a far better position for the long term. But for that to work, and that could have been a compromise. When you think about what all that is, Republicans want entitlement reform, Democrats want more revenues, et cetera. That could have been the basis for compromise, except that we have a Congress that simply will not function in a mode of compromise, and our democracy
When I was younger and working in the White House and briefly in Congress as a staff person, those days, a person who was considered a great legislator was somebody that knew how to work out a compromise. They would go behind closed doors and they would work out a compromise. Today, a great legislator is a great fundraiser. If you're a compromiser, you're not considered a great legislator today, and you have no chance of rising up. It's a sad situation.
I mean, to me,
and
one
we've
of the
got to
fundamental
figure, somehow
questions...
all of us as Americans, I think totally agree with David. Also, a great legislator today is a person who can defend the partisan interests of his party, as opposed to what David said. As citizens of this country, we have got to find some way of solving this political problem, and if we do, I think we can have a great future. And if we don't, I think we have the potential, at least, for having a much more difficult future.
One of the central questions, I think, is the Republican Party is now in a place that strikes me as quite similar to where the Democrats were in the 80s, which is they have a House majority. They have some reason to think they can hold that House majority for quite a long time. But holding their House majority in some ways makes it harder for them to win national presidential elections. And the question is, at what point does the Republican Party continue to say, we want to be a philosophically pure party, we don't want to compromise as much, even at the expense of losing presidential elections? The Democrats had to lose a lot of times before they became comfortable nominating a Bill Clinton. And it's not clear to me that the Republicans are that close to having that kind of moment.
Who are the Republicans? In other words, who speaks for the Republican Party anymore? It's
I
not
would
Mitt
still-
Romney. And most House members just care about getting reelected.
Right.
Unless, and they don't, or they get run for the Senate eventually. But they don't really focus on having the White House be controlled by their party as much as their own reelection. And I don't think they're going to compromise on it to make the Republican nominee be more moderate and let the more moderate Republican nominee, who could theoretically win the election, the general election, get the nomination, if it's going to mean, so they're going to have to do some things that are ideologically difficult for them. So it's a very unusual situation in Washington today where very few things are getting done. And maybe some people would say that's good, but Congress is going to pass very little legislation. The only things that are going to pass are non-economic issues. Immigration may well pass at some point, but not before the end of the Congress. Obviously, the Senate's passed the bill, the House will completely rework it, and maybe there'll be a conference, and probably the Republicans feel they need to have a bill on immigration before they go into the elections, but it'll be a much different bill than passed the Senate. So it's a sad situation. At the risk of, I've depressed everybody, and Bob maybe has depressed everybody, and so I want to maybe not depress everybody. Let me give you some good news. I agree with Bob. If you take the investment world and divide it into 4 parts, the United States, other developed markets, which would be largely Western Europe and Japan, the emerging markets, which would be the emerged countries, China, India, Brazil, Russia, and then the frontier countries. Out of all these places, by far the best place to put your money today is the United States. It's not even close, because we're still growing at a reasonable rate, despite all the problems we talked about in Congress and our unemployment, our income disparity. We are still growing at a reasonable rate. We have greater rule of law, greater transparency, greater management depth, greater financing skills, greater markets, greater liquidity in the markets. Nobody is comparable to us. And today, if you were going to look for who would be second best, it wouldn't be clear that it would be the other developed markets because of Europe's problems and because of Japan's problems. I think probably the emerging markets, such as China, India, Brazil, would probably be among the greatest places in which to put your money because they're high growth rates, large populations, and the need for the kind of goods and services that we often can sell them and so forth. So I think these are very attractive places to invest. If you really have a risk profile, some of the frontier markets in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia would be very attractive as well. But again, the United States is still the place where most people around the world, when I travel, they really want to invest their money here. And a disproportionate amount of foreign direct investment is coming into the United States compared to where it was just a couple years ago. And the dollar strengthening, I think, is going to make the United States even more attractive as a place to invest.
You know, I'll just add one more. As I said before, I obviously agree with David, since David was agreeing with me. I do think the United States is where I would most want to put money. I think it's a good analysis of the areas. You know, we've had a historically resilient political system. There are plenty of times in American history when our system has really failed us, and then it has come back. And I think the historic question, and I think it is an historic question for the United States, is will we once again come back? Or are we now at a point where it will not again function in a manner effective enough to meet our needs? And if history is any guide, it suggests that it will come back only because it always has. And as David said, and I think I may have said it as well, we have a dynamic society, and the history of our resilience, but the dynamism of our society would at least me to think the probabilities it will come back. But when you get into the specifics, as we've just now done, the path is certainly, the problems are immense, the pathway is not clear, and it's going to probably be a long and messy process.
The greatest things going for our economy right now are, after 7 years or so, home building is finally coming back. And usually recessions are ended and recoveries occur because housing prices and home building occurs again. So that's finally occurring again at pretty much everywhere around the United States. And housing prices are coming up, and that's probably pretty good. The energy revolution is something really you can't dismiss as being insignificant. About 2 years ago, we were producing 5.5 million barrels of oil a day. We're close to producing 7.5 million barrels of oil a day. We will be very shortly energy independent, and that will give us a lot more flexibility in what we do, but it will also really help our economy because not only are we producing more, but we're building infrastructure, terminals, all kinds of pipelines, other things that is building infrastructure and is really helping with jobs. So that's a very important thing that's going on in the economy. And manufacturing insourcing is occurring again. People are finding, because cheap gas and other things, it's cheaper to produce things here now than in some places in in Europe, in some places over in the emerging markets. So these things are very good. And one of the other things we have are two things that I think are really important. One Bob mentioned as well is the R&D and the creativity of our economy. We reinvent our economy and reinvent ourselves all the time. That's what Americans are about, always reinventing ourselves. And the R&D and the things that go on in Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley equivalents around the United States are the envy of the world. Everybody around the world wants to have a Silicon Valley or a Silicon Valley equivalent, and we really have it, and we're way ahead of everybody else in the world in that. And lastly, our higher education system is also the envy of the world. While it has its problems, there's no doubt there's some funding problems in state universities now, and even private universities are challenged a bit. The higher education system we have is the envy of the world, and is one of the great things that we have as our national assets. And I think all these things will combine to make us a very important economy for a long time. But in 1940, let's say 1960, we were 46% of the world's GDP. We were almost half the world's GDP in this one country. Today, we're roughly 22%, so less than half. And we're not going to be as dominant economy as we were in 1960 or 1955 or 1965 or 1970, because the emerging market has finally emerged. The emerging markets actually listen to us, and a lot of them developed market economies after the Cold War ended, and they are outproducing us in certain areas. So we have real competitors now, but it's still, we're still ahead of many others in certain areas. And I think for the lifetime of most people in this room, I think we'll still be one of the largest economies in the world.
I agree with David, but let me just
Well, the
add-
reason we agree, I should say,
Well-
our name is almost the same. See, when Bob Rubin is his name, and mine is Rubenstein. Well, my name, when my ancestors came over, was Reuben, and when we got to Ellis Island, they said, give us a more ethnic name. We want to make sure people know we're Jewish. So they added Stein to it, but otherwise we might be linked, because we probably have the same name.
my name actually...
My name was actually something, it was Rubenstein, and they shortened it?
No, it was Wilson.
Wilson.
But leaving that aside
Okay.
for the moment, I think Dave and I really do agree on the fundamentals, and I think they are very promising. But I can't help but be enormously focused on this political issue, because just take all the positives that David cited, every single one of which I would agree with, and I think there are others as well. But how do you think we will do over the next 10 or 15 years if our debt to GDP ratio keeps going up and up and up and up, which it will, given what lies ahead in terms of our entitlements particularly, but not only our entitlements? What will happen if our bridges are not better than they are today? If our basic research suffers, as it will suffer because we're not going to have federal revenues? If our school buildings continue to deteriorate? And what will happen if we don't do a lot better job on K through 12 education, if we don't have an energy policy, if we don't do a better job on constraining the increase in health care costs? So I continue to think that with all of the great strengths we have, how we fare over the long run, I'm not talking about the next 2-3 years, over the long run, is going to be enormously affected by whether our political system begins to function moderately well. That's all it needs to do, moderately well.
We're going to open this up to questions from you all in just a few minutes. I want to hit a few other topics quickly before we do. So when we think about the long-term threats to the prosperity and standards of living in this country, have we spent too much relative time talking about Social Security and Medicare and taxes and not enough time talking about the climate?
Oh, boy. Can I take a short shot at that?
No,
you go.
Well, you mean about climate change and climate?
Yeah.
Well, climate change is like something everybody is concerned about, or most people are concerned about it, but there's very little we can do now that's going to affect what happens. In other words, if we do certain economic things, we might be able to fix Social Security, fix Medicare, Medicaid, get our deficit under control, and so forth. There's very little that we can do as a country that is going to solve the climate issue of global warming. We can make progress, and we should, but when you look at the things you can do with the time available and the resources you have, since it's not just a U.S. issue, it's a global issue, our ability to impact climate change is much less than it is our ability to affect these other issues that you just referred to.
I think our key problem, as you know, fiscally, is Medicare. And Medicare that in turn is some fair measure of function of health care costs and what's going to happen to those. And who's ever interested, we have a 5 o'clock panel today with Peter Orszag, Ken Davis, myself. We're going to discuss that. So there. Global climate change, I guess, David, I have a slightly different view. I don't know enough about the science, but I'm sort of convinced that nobody does, even the scientists most expert in this. But I'm kind of persuaded by something that Al Gore said to me a long time ago. We were in the White House together. We were walking down World David Roosevelt because he was there. There's a corridor between the Oval Office and the Vice President's office. We were walking down there and he said, you know, nobody knows if this is absolutely certain. I think most scientists think today it probably is. And nobody knows when it's going to eventuate, when it's going to materialize. But we can't take the risk of being wrong. Because if we're wrong, then we've reached a point where the inundative effects are going to be overwhelming. And I guess that's kind of a view that I've come to share. It is true. What David says is absolutely right. The United States cannot solve this. On the other hand, life on Earth could really be massively affected by this. And there are serious people who think the time frame may be much shorter than the prevailing view. So I think what the United States should try to do, because David's right, we cannot solve this problem. But I think if we had a political system that would function on this, I think what we should do is do what we need to do now, and then we should go to the rest of the world, which after has been much more, in some ways, much more willing to deal with this than we have, and try to provide a moral leadership. I also saw, David, the other day, well, I was in China a few weeks ago, but then I saw when I came back that there's some consideration, in China at least, of having some kind of a partial cap and trade, which, if so, would be an important step on China's part. If you had China and the United States both coalescing around this, that's a lot of moral suasion as well as place in the world.
The Kyoto Agreement.
Well, I'm not saying
The Kyoto Agreement was agreed to under President Clinton, but it wasn't actually sent to Congress because it was clear Congress wouldn't give it any votes.
Absolutely correct.
And any agreement that is similar to that is not going to get through this Congress the way Congress works. So you're going to have to do this outside of Congress. And what's actually happening is not only is climate change becoming an important issue, and hopefully 10 years from now, 20 years from now, all of us will look differently and think that we did something, and actually we actually have done something to make a difference. But other countries are taking advantage of what climate change is doing to the world in economic ways that are going to benefit them. Let me mention one of them. Because of climate change, the Arctic ice cap is melting. Anybody, you can say why it's melting for lots of reasons, but it's melting, probably because of global warming. And so other countries now have figured out that they can ship things through the Arctic 9 months of the year. There's mining and minerals that you can develop there, and with environmentally safe ways, if you find them, 20% of the world's oil and 15% of the world's gas is in the Arctic. And the reason it's up there is because when the world was billions of years ago, that part of the world was hot or was warm, and there was vegetation, and ultimately became oil and gas over billions of years. So that's why it's up there. And the United States is not able to do anything in that area. Other countries, Russia and other countries, are exploiting it because we haven't adopted the law of the Sea Treaty. That treaty has been around for about 30 years, and Republican members of the Senate refused to endorse it. And because of that, everybody else is now going to take advantage of what's happened because of climate change in the Arctic, and they are going to exploit all the minerals, oil, and gas when we're really unable to do so because we haven't endorsed that treaty.
Let's get one more topic in before we open up. Ben Bernanke. At the very least, President Obama doesn't seem to have tried very hard to persuade him to serve a third term. I am skeptical of the. I'm skeptical of the notion.
I think the press got carried away and misinterpreted what the president said.
Oh, forget about the Charlie Rose thing. Let's even set that aside. I don't think. I'm skeptical of the notion that Bernanke has no interest in a third term. I think at the very least, Obama hasn't wanted to push very hard to persuade him to do it. I think it may even be more than that. And so I guess, what would you say to someone who thinks Obama's done the right thing by not trying harder to get Bernanke to serve a third term? The argument for that would be, as Ben Bernanke himself has argued, we do not want to create a cult of personality in monetary policy. We want to get the sense that multiple people could do this. 2 terms is enough. And it makes sense now to do someone else. Do you think that's right? Do you think it's good that the Fed will have a new leader, or do you think Bernanke should have had his arm twisted to serve a third term?
My view is that Ben Bernanke reinvented the Federal Reserve System. When they went through the crisis with AIG and so forth, I think that Ben Bernanke stepped up. Obviously, Secretary Paulson did a great job working with him. But when Paulson left and Tim Geithner came in, the Fed, on its own, reinvented itself. Remember, the Fed's purpose, when it was set up under Woodrow Wilson, was to make sure our currency wasn't debased and we didn't really have inflation too high, and we really had a strong currency. But the Fed has adopted the notion that its mission is to stimulate the economy. That really wasn't what the Fed was supposed to do. And the Fed decided, because Congress was dysfunctional, that the only game in town, the only way to get the economy going again and to get out of this, the worst part of the recession, was to stimulate the economy. The only way you could do it was QE1, QE2, and QE3. I think Ben Bernanke did a wonderful job there, but he didn't really want to be appointed the second time. In other words, he wanted one term. he realized that if he didn't get a second term, it would look like he was chased out of town. He would prefer, in my view, to have served 2 years and then left if he could have. Then the problems became bigger and he agreed to stay. I don't believe he had any interest in staying in a third term. The president could have articulated his interest in Bernanke and thinking how great he was, but I don't really think the president really wanted, I don't think Bernanke wanted a third term, and I don't think the president could have persuaded him to have one. You would know better.
I think I'm going to leave that subject. Okay. And I think what I'm going to focus on is something slightly differently, though it's your subject. I think the question of where we are in terms of Federal Reserve policy is actually a very difficult one. I totally agree with David. I think QE1 was absolutely critical to getting off the abyss. I agree with that. I think the QE3 is I think that's a much more difficult judgment to make. I agree with something David said. I think surely commentators say that the justification for QE3 was the fact that our policy process wasn't working. I agree with that. But the right question was, with respect to QE3, what are the costs going to be and what are the risks going to be? Or, I'm sorry, what are the benefits going to be and what are the risks going to be? I think most analysts think the benefits have been somewhat limited, probably. Rates were very low before it started and so forth. Let's leave the debate about benefits aside, but I think that is a pretty broadly prevailing view, at least. I think the risks are really quite, well, I'll say they're real. There was a moral hazard risk with our political system. There's the question, even if the bond market wasn't much affected by the Fed buying, and you can debate that one way or the other, but even if it wasn't, I think there is a broadly held, I know there's a broadly held view, that as you go out the risk spectrum, it has contributed to excesses because of a comfort that the Fed will continue on its present mode. By the way, even if it didn't affect the bond market too much in terms of creating low rates, I do think there's an asymmetry because of the psychology around the Fed, so that when they stop buying, and you've seen this in the last couple of months, I thought this was beforehand actually, that you were likely to get a spike up in rates. But the big risk, the important risk, and the one that could affect all of us, is how are they going to get out of this thing? And they have unprecedented size of balance sheet. They have unprecedented monetary conditions. Forget technically what's monetary base, one thing or another. Unprecedented monetary conditions. It is always very difficult for the Fed to figure out how to deal with rates so that they get the right path through tipping over into a negative place on the one hand and inflation on the other hand. And now they're going to have to do it with unprecedented size, with conditions that are unprecedented in terms of the size of the balance sheet and monetary conditions. And I think that creates enormous uncertainties. Yes, I think that creates enormous uncertainties and creates a very, very difficult challenge for the Fed and a set of risks that I've just articulated that I at least find quite troubling.
Okay, let's turn it over to you all. We've got a question right here. I think, do we have some microphones going? Great, let's get right over here, and then we'll go over there next. Ma'am in the second row. And I'll ask you all to keep the questions brief.
Thank you very much. There is a battle raging now in between all of the Krugmans of the world wanting jobs and infrastructure now, and others who only wanted to take care of the deficit. But as you all said, there is huge unemployment, huge income disparity. In the African American community and in the Hispanic community, it's even worse because many of these folks are unemployable because of the lack of skills. So my question is, how do you reconcile these two viewpoints in order to mitigate unemployment and income disparity? Thank you.
Bob, go ahead.
I'll give you one sentence answer, which is my view. I think it's a false choice. The battle, it's not only here, but it's in the Eurozone too, the battle between, on the one hand, jobs and growth now, which is extremely important, and on the other hand, dealing with our fiscal situation, which is also extremely important, I think it's a false choice. I think if we put in place a deficit reduction program, I actually described it before, a deficit reduction program which deferred implementation for 2 or 3 years with an effective implementation mechanism, we got rid of the sequester, I think you could create business confidence now, you'd get rid of the fiscal drag from the sequester now, I think that would increase job creation and in hiring now, and investment now, and I think it would begin the process of addressing our long-term problem. One person's view.
I have a couple points I just would add. That when we all went to college, you read the standard textbooks, it would said full employment is more or less 4%. I'm afraid that we are now coming to the new norm that full employment is going to be seen as 6%, which is, I think, too high. I also think that we should recognize that the reason unemployment rate isn't even higher than it is today, and it's still high, is because people have dropped out of the workforce. Yes. Historically, in the United States, you had maybe of working age people, something like, say, 64%, 65% of the people in working age in the workforce. Now it's about 61 or 62%. So people have dropped out of the workforce, and they've dropped out because of two things. One, people my age and a little bit younger, when they got laid off in the Great Recession, they basically said, I can't get a job, I'm just going to retire, and they just dropped out of the workforce. And young people who graduated from college, they are coming home to live with their parents again, as some of you may know. And therefore, you know, they're not able to get jobs. And so you have a smaller percentage of people in the workforce, and it's a very sad situation. And the other point you mentioned is very true. These unemployment numbers, 13.4% marginally attached, 7.6% official unemployment rate, they are the blended rate. The rate for Hispanic or black unemployment is very high, much higher. Black teenage unemployment in urban areas now is approaching, 50% in some cities. So you can't sustain an economy and you can't sustain the growth rates we want when you have teenage unemployment rate among minorities at that kind of level. And even among whites, it's very high in certain urban areas. So we've got a lot more to do to worry about the unemployment rate than I think just getting it down a couple pegs.
There was a hand back there I saw.
If I go see a movie at the Isis Theater and buy a quart-sized bottle of Dasani water, that'll cost, the water costs more than a gallon of gasoline. What is your view from an economic standpoint of a significant gasoline tax at 50 cents or $1 or more a gallon so that our prices could approach Europe? And if you both think it's a good thing where that money could go to infrastructure and for the environment and research and development and jobs and all that, is there any way that that could be impacted in Congress?
That's an idea, that's a very good idea. It's been around for 25 years or more, and no Congress will vote for it. I haven't seen a Congress willing to vote for, let's say, a 50-cent or 75-cent gallon tax because they think it's extremely unpopular. The truth is, everybody's not happy with the price of gasoline. It's very high today. In real terms, it's much lower than it was in the late 70s. In the late 70s, it was actually higher in real terms. In real terms, the gasoline price here is very low and even much lower compared to Europe. I think a gasoline tax would be a wonderful thing, but it's in the concept of, having a lot of fantasies in this world. We all have fantasies, right? Well, that's a fantasy, and it's just not going to happen.
I have nothing to add.
Yeah. Sir, right here. I think the one thing that could change it while the microphone's getting there is a much bigger Sandy or a series of Sandys. I think that is the one thing that could change the politics.
A gas tax, you think?
Generally around climate policy.
That's a different matter.
John Debs, Palo Alto.
Including taxes.
Bob, could I just follow up? Let's say you were appointed the next head of the Fed. I know you're not going to be, or the secret advisor to the next head of the Fed. How would you go about responsibly unwinding this $3 trillion of mortgage and treasuries that the Fed has accumulated here?
Chairman Rubin.
Carefully. I think I'm going to a little bit not respond to that maybe. I think I'd rather, look, I think we really do have, I think it really is an immense challenge. And I mean, I do have some views as to what I think I would do. I'm very far from clear that my views are the better views. Others probably others do have better views. The one thing I think I'm not going to actually directly respond, and for a variety of reasons, but I will say this, just one comment if I may. I don't think you get much of a guide from econometric models. I think an awful lot of what gets thought about and discussed in these arenas are these very sophisticated econometric models. But the reality is that reality itself is massively more complex than be captured by any econometric model, if for no other reason, because econometric models of necessity are based on what's already happened, and any new set of circumstances is going to be very different in all kinds of ways than what's already happened. Plus, there'll be a psychology of markets and a psychology of economic behavior that no model can capture.
I can give you an analogy that I would use. When I worked on Capitol Hill, we used to pass legislation and send it to the administration, and we said, well, this is not really perfectly drafted, but the administration will figure it out. When I worked in the White House, we would send legislation to Capitol Hill and say, we don't really know how to do this, but they'll figure it out in Capitol Hill. So now I think the way I would look at it is the Fed and people the Fed say, well, we're not sure how to really do this tapering off, but the market will figure it out when we come out with a policy. The market is sitting there saying, well, we don't really know what the Fed's going to do, but they really are experienced. They're going to figure it out and they'll do it right. And I don't think anybody really knows the right answer to this. It's a case of first impression, and nobody really has an answer for sure because we're doing something that hasn't been done before.
Obviously, I totally agree with that. Just to disaggregate, though, for a moment, one issue is the so-called tapering off, and I think this idea that somebody you can taper off with markets is itself a sort of interesting use of terms. Markets don't tend to react that way. But that's the question of the slowing and then the ceasing of the buying. That's one problem. The much bigger problem is how do you unwind what you've already got?
See, also, the word tapering off, you don't taper off $85 billion a month. You could lumber off or something, but some other word, but not taper off. I guess you use a better word to make it clear to people it's not so easy.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, despite the fact that we have not gotten to marijuana, I have to wrap us up, unless either of you wants to add something.
Well, we can go to the marijuana, it's still on. Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you to both.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. I would say that was pretty lively.